Hello and welcome to today's webinar entitled Enhancing Poverty Alleviation Performance, Amplifying the Voice of Local Stakeholders. My name is Sandra Draheim and I am the Marketing Manager for the William Davidson Institute at the University of Michigan, who is bringing you this webinar today. The William Davidson Institute, or WDI as we will be calling it today, is an independent nonprofit education, research, and applied practice organization. And we're dedicated to actionable business and public policy approaches to address challenges and opportunities in emerging market economies. Today's webinar is the second in a series of 3 webinars about assessing poverty alleviation performance, and we hope you will attend the next one, as well as the hands-on impact assessment workshop to be held this October here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. The dates and times of these events are on the first slide, and you should be able to see that now, and you can get details and register at the link provided on the slide. Couple of housekeeping notes. If you have questions during this webinar presentation, please type them into the dialog box on your screen and then press send. We will answer as many of your questions as possible at the end of the presentation so that all attendees can hear the answers. Please know that this webinar is being recorded, and I will provide all attendees, and in fact anyone who registered, with a link to it within a day or two of this session this morning. I'd like to introduce today's presenters, starting with Heather Esper and Yaquta Fatehi. Heather is WDI's Impact Assessment Program Manager, and Yaquta is a research associate in the same program. Our guest speaker today is Kat Harrison, Director, Impact and Research at SolarAid, which is an international charity providing access to clean, affordable solar lights. As we move to the next slide, you'll see what today's agenda will be. We'll start with a brief recap of the first webinar for those of you that couldn't attend that one. That will be followed by Heather and Yaquta discussing the various steps and qualitative methodologies for measuring outcomes of poverty reduction programs. Then Kat Harrison from SolarAid will share how her organization worked with WDI to measure the impact of one of their social enterprises. And then after a brief synopsis of the next webinar on July 18th, the final 15 to 20 minutes of this hour will be dedicated to answering questions that you send to me through the presentation. So please remember to type and send those questions using the dialog box at any point throughout the presentation. I'll now turn over the presentation to Heather.
Thanks, Sandy. Welcome back to our Impact Assessment webinar series. In the first webinar, at a high level, we just want to remind you what we took away from it. We talked about the value of capturing multidimensional poverty reduction metrics. And the 3 main key components to do that are, first, including the voice of all local stakeholders in your assessment, moving beyond economic indicators and including other types of well-being, such as capability and relationship metrics in your assessment as well as the third point, which is assessing both the positive and negative changes. Today we're going to be talking about how to do this qualitatively to capture these multidimensional poverty metrics, and then on our third webinar we're going to talk about quantitative methods to do so. You can find a recording of our first webinar if you want to rewatch that or use that as a reference using the link that's at the top of this page, and we'll be sending this out afterwards too, so you'll have that link as well. A framework that we've found that's very helpful in holistically capturing these 3 components of measuring your multidimensional poverty reduction metrics is the Basic Pyramid Impact Assessment Framework. The framework, as you see, assesses impact across local stakeholders, including the buyers, the sellers, and the community, as well as across 3 areas of well-being that we talked about in our first webinar. Economic well-being, as a recap, assesses changes in an individual's short and long-term financial resources. Capability well-being captures an individual's agency, such as the knowledge and skills they possess, as well as the state of their psychological health and physical health. And then the third area, relationship well-being, encompasses the opportunities and resources and individual experiences through their roles or status in the community. It also captures changes in interactions within an individual's social networks and the environment they live. Today we're going to be providing an example of how we qualitatively assess the impact of ventures using this framework. The methodology that we're going to talk about that's associated with this framework is interactive in that stakeholders inform which impacts are collected. It's interactive in that it's customizable to a venture's needs. You'll also see that it's systematic because the example we're going to share allowed us to compare the same impacts across multiple ventures from different sectors and geographies. And it informs action. So you can make changes to your business model based on doing this qualitative assessment. Now we're going to jump into our first poll question.
Thank you, Heather. We had a poll question planned for right now, but that is unavailable to me right now. So Heather, I'm going to turn it back to you to keep moving through the presentation. We'll have a poll question in a few minutes.
Sounds good. And just let me know when, or maybe when I switch to Yaquta, we can put it up. All right. So moving on, the methodology that I mentioned, that we're going to talk about today, is holistic in that the purpose of it is to look at both Sorry, let me back up. The methodology we're going to talk about today helps you assess your multidimensional poverty outcomes, and it consists of both qualitative and quantitative components. The first phase, which is the strategic analysis, is the qualitative component, and that's what the focus of today's call is going to be. And the purpose of the strategic analysis is to gain a holistic understanding of the venture's impacts and begin to prioritize those impacts based on magnitude, which would be how large an effect the impact has on stakeholders, and likelihood, how likely the impact is to occur. The findings from this phase can be used to inform actions such as improving the business model. So say your findings from the strategic analysis phase show your ventures having little to no impact on stakeholders' capability well-being, then you can develop some strategies to change this. Maybe implement a new training program that targets a specific area of capability well-being that you want. Or perhaps you notice your ventures having a negative impact, you can then work to mitigate that and implement different changes to the model. Prioritized impacts from the strategic analysis can also be quantified in the next phase, which is the performance analysis phase. Although you can stop here at the strategic analysis phase, you may want to move into the performance analysis phase if you need to demonstrate the effect of your program, so showing causality. So depending on what you want to prove, you can implement a range of research options with various robustness, which, as you can see on the left of the slide, could include having a survey, different size samples. There's a number of different components that you can think about and how to quantify that impact. And we're going to talk about those elements on our third webinar. The methodology overall is an iterative process. Like, not only can the findings from either the strategic analysis or the performance analysis inform future business plans and innovation, but you can also inform future evaluation measures. So during the performance analysis, you may identify impacts you want to explore more deeply and qualitatively in the strategic analysis phase. So you may get to the end of the performance analysis phase and then say, oh, I really found something neat and I want to explore it more, so I'm going to jump back into the strategic analysis phase. So you can keep repeating this. And the entire process can be repeated, especially if you're making changes to your business model and you want to make sure you're capturing all the new changes in poverty. As I mentioned, the purpose of the strategic analysis phase is to identify a holistic set of impacts and prioritize them so the findings can be used to improve the business model or inform which impacts should be quantified in the performance analysis phase. At a high level, the activities we conduct to qualitatively assess a venture's impact include, first, conducting background research to identify potential impacts through a literature review, expert interviews, and then the second part is around conducting primary data collection to refine these impacts through semi-structured interviews and focus groups with a range of stakeholders, and then analyzing that data. I'm not going to go over the details of these methods here, as Yaquta and I will go into the specifics of this methodology using an example of how we qualitatively assess BOP enterprises' multidimensional impacts in a project we recently completed with the support of the Bernard Van Leer Foundation. This slide is rather meant to be a reference slide. After the webinar, you'll be sent the slides that Sandy mentioned and the webinar video, so you can refer to this slide at a later time when you're designing your qualitative methodology. The project we're going to go through today to illustrate these qualitative methods is one where we focus on assessing the change and impact from different enterprises occurring on children. The reason we focus on children is that children are often the most vulnerable to poverty's effects. It's been found that the damage caused by poverty during early childhood can transcend into adulthood and onto the next generation. And then for this reason, many economists argue that money spent on this phase is actually the most powerful investment a country can make. For this project, we used the base of the pyramid impact assessment framework to compare and contrast multidimensional poverty outcomes on young children for 3 different business strategies. Those that sell products to the base of the pyramid, which included Sunny Money and Patrimonio Oi. Sunny Money sells Pico Solar products to BOP communities, and Patrimonio Oi provides construction materials to low-income consumers. The second BOP strategy we assessed included Penda Health and Sanergy. Penda Health provides standardized primary care with both curative and preventative care to BOP communities, and then Sanergy provides, they build modular sanitation facilities and sell them to local entrepreneurs. And then the third strategy we looked at was ventures that source from the base of the pyramid. So we have Honey Care Africa here, which supplies smallholder farmers with beehives and harvest management services, and then they source honey from them. And then Via Andina produces high-quality agro-industrial food products through its work with local smallholder farmers, and they provide trainings on organic cultivation techniques, etc. We chose to have 2 companies within each of these 3 strategies to help strengthen our conclusions. Although the example we're giving you today shows us assessing 6 different companies, you can obviously use the same methodology to assess a single company. We customized this base of pyramid assessment framework a little bit for the purposes of our study, and we wanted to use this example to show you that you can play around with the framework as well. Originally, the framework is only meant to look at direct impacts, but we also wanted to look at indirect impacts. So let me define that for you. Each venture we assessed of those 6 companies, we've explored both direct impacts from the enterprise on the child. So for example, with Sunny Money, what a direct impact on a child might be, they get the solar lamp, and so they're studying at night using the solar lamp instead of a kerosene lamp. So they have changes in their physical health from no longer breathing in the kerosene. And then we also look at indirect impacts. So those impacts that occur on the child as a result of the venture's direct impact on their caregivers or the environment. Using that same example, an example of an impact that goes directly to a parent from Sunny Money would be that they no longer need to buy as much kerosene, so they have some savings. But the indirect impact occurs on the child based on how the parent uses those savings, because you can't assume that parent is going to use the savings all and contribute it all to the child. We also customized the framework. As you'll notice, there's a lot more columns here. We put additional stakeholders across the base of the pyramid ventures value chain. So we added employees, we added distributors and producers, because we wanted to assess the same stakeholders across all the ventures. As you're going to see later, not all the ventures we assessed have the same exact stakeholders. So for example, Sunny Money and Sunny Money and Sanergy are the only ones that have distributors in their model, but we wanted to make sure we were comparing apples to apples, so we used the same framework. And then we also we came up with a core set of impacts to explore for the same set of stakeholders across all 6 enterprises. So we explored the same set of economic well-being indicators for all the stakeholders for each enterprise, and we assessed the same impacts for capability well-being, as you'll see here, and then relationship well-being. So we looked at all these impacts across all 6 ventures. To start our individual assessment of each venture, we first conducted a literature review using documents provided by the venture, reports from places like UNICEF, the World Bank, etc. And we also used academic research to identify potential impacts that are likely to occur on the child, either directly or indirectly from the enterprise. To supplement our literature review, we also did some expert interviews with over the phone with people that are very well versed in each of the sectors that the ventures were working. To refine these impacts that we identified, so first we just filled in the framework for each venture, and then we wanted to refine and identify additional impacts. So we wanted to visit each enterprise on site and carry out face-to-face interviews with stakeholders. So this is where we're going to get into the real nitty-gritty of qualitative work. For our on-site visit, we aim to hear from a range of stakeholders to further refine our impacts from the literature review and attempt to identify additional ones. Our considerations when selecting stakeholders to interview was to make sure we really talk to a range of different types of people. We also really wanted to make sure we were talking to people that are hard to find, such as someone that had left the program, because they're going to have a very different perspective than those that are eager to participate. And the reason we want to speak to a range of stakeholders is that it helps triangulate our findings. So triangulation means hearing the same information from different types of people. As an example, it would strengthen your findings if a school representative, an interview with a school representative, and then an interview with a customer of a child who bought a solar lamp, and then a third person, say someone from the enterprise staff, all tell you that they've seen the same impact occur for children whose family buy the solar lamp, such as improved school performance. Each of our on-site visits began with interviews with the enterprise's senior management team, and then it was followed by in-depth, semi-structured qualitative interviews with a robust set of key stakeholders. As you can see, we spoke to a variety of stakeholders during our visit with each enterprise. Each enterprise, we talked to external organizations, so these included the government, schools, partners, others working in the community, other organizations working in the community that weren't familiar even with the company we were assessing. We also made sure we spoke to non-users in the community, so you see that we spoke to non-customers for Sunny Money, we spoke to non-patients for Penta Health, just to understand what may have occurred, any changes that were occurring to the group that we were assessing, say the customers, weren't also occurring to the people not involved with the company. We also conducted a few focus groups. Conducting focus groups in addition to interviews is helpful because it allows people to begin to build off of each other, and maybe you'll get a little bit deeper into the data collection and depth in the types of impacts you're assessing, because they may build off each other and an impact that one of them hadn't considered. We also, we don't like always using only focus groups because they're very different. When you use interviews, you get some more unbiased information. So I think using a mix of focus groups and interviews is a good way to go. Now I'm going to go over some key things to consider when preparing for and conducting qualitative interviews. In preparing for your face-to-face interviews, it's a really good idea to design an interview protocol to guide your conversation with stakeholders. Our protocol employed several strategies to assess impacts of each venture. Our protocol was set up so that first we built rapport, started a conversation, made it really easy questions in the beginning, and then we dove into exploring each of the impacts within the framework that you saw earlier. So we explored the same impacts across areas of well-being for each venture. So we dove into maybe capability well-being impacts, and we included a number of questions for each impact because we wanted to try to get at it from different angles. And when you craft your questions, you kind of want to have them open-ended, and it's easier to kind of get a little bit more information. So as an example, with Penta Health, there was a lot going on with physical health, so we couldn't just ask how has your physical health changed over since you started working with or started going to Penta Health for healthcare services. So we went into the effects of nutritional counseling and different products that or services they provide. We also went into how have you changed your family's diet, what types of food are you guys eating, etc. So you need to try to have a few, maybe 3 to 4 questions recommended perhaps for each impact that you want to get into. Our protocol also looked at how we also asked people within our interviews to compare their children to other children in the community so we could get a better understanding of if these impacts were actually happening to others there. We also wanted to have people during the interview compare the impact on their child to their child, let me rephrase that. We also wanted people during these interviews to compare their current state of their child's well-being to their child's well-being before they ever interacted with the venture. So we were trying to get at some of the causality with those types of questions. We used a lot of follow-up probes so we could make sure we're getting at both positive and negative impacts and changes. We also put sensitive questions at the end of the survey because it's really important to build rapport before diving into changes in income. And during our interviews, it's really important to watch body language, notice when people are starting to get tired, because when they're tired, they're not going to give you as good of data anymore. Another thing we did, we used informed consent forms. These are good ideas since it might be the first time that someone's taking a survey, so it's really important, even if you don't use an informed consent form, to have a detailed introduction to the survey so that the person knows how the data is going to be used that you collect, the time commitment, like maybe they need to go to work and you're trying to make them sit down for an hour. You need to let them know how their participation will or will not affect their relationship with the venture. Let them know that they have the right to end the interview at any point in time, the confidentiality of the data, how they can contact someone if they have questions later on. So it's really important, I think, to have this element so that people are really aware of what you're doing and your purpose. I think it's an important part that a lot of people do leave out when they're interviewing the base of the pyramid. We also recommend recording interviews. It's almost nearly impossible to take perfect notes during the interview, so often when you're in the analysis phase, you find you need to go back and check what the exact wording of someone said was, and the only way to really do that is if you have a recording of it. We take lots of pictures when we go out on site of the context, try to gather as many documents as possible as well, such as reports, et cetera, that maybe partner organizations or the government recommend reading about these changes that might be occurring. So it helps collecting all this additional information from different modes, like photography or et cetera. It really helps provide a richer understanding of the context than what you might be able to collect when you're just sitting at your own desk. Translators, when you're using translators, it's really important to consider whether you want word-for-word translation or if you want interpretation, where the interpretation would mean that the individual would kind of would summarize what someone's saying rather than giving you the exact text of what they're saying. It's important if you're going to use interpretation that maybe you spend some time with the individual that's going to interpret things, that they really understand the purpose of the study or the questions you're going to ask so that they can help hone in on those specific parts when they interpret the information back to you. And then finally, it's really important to regularly review the data during data collection because that allows you to recognize emerging patterns that you might want to probe more deeply into while you're there. It also allows you to begin to prioritize impacts based on likelihood and magnitude that I spoke about earlier. And you can adapt your questions in your protocol to assess and dive deeper into those emerging patterns or begin to test your hypotheses about which impacts are that are the highest priority. So you can say, I've noticed, and you can go out the next day to maybe the customers in your interviews and say, I've started to notice when I've been talking to customers yesterday that it seems like this seems to be a really important change. Would that be the most important change you've experienced from working with, say, Sunny Money? And then that allows them to say, oh, no, I feel this way. And you can begin to, like I said, test your hypotheses. And reviewing the data regularly also allows you to understand when saturation is reached. And when I say saturation, I mean when additional data collection won't yield any new insights for answering the questions that you set out to answer with the survey. So with that being said, that's a lot of information, and this is something, has a lot of text on this slide, but the purpose again was you can refer to it later with the webinar recording or the slides we send out. And now I'm going to turn it over to Yaquta, who's going to talk about how we analyze the findings. Yaquta, I can't hear you if you are speaking.
Yes, sorry. Thanks everyone for joining us. In the second half of the WDI presentation, what I'm going to do is take you through the steps that we conducted in data analysis, and then also just take you through some very high-level findings and a few recommendations around those findings. So let's get right with the data analysis. First, what we did is once we came back to our office, we developed detailed summaries of the actual interviews that we conducted, and wherever there were gaps, we reheard our recordings. And I know that's really time-consuming, but it's completely worth the effort. The next thing we did is we started seeing patterns. So the emerging patterns came about, and Heather mentioned that we also saw this in the field, but we continued to do that once we were back in the office. And then we also coded impacts. And we used 3 types of codes. So the first type of code was what kind of impact was it by area of well-being? Was it economic, capability, or relationship? The second type of code that we used was type of stakeholder. Was it customer? Was it a distributor? Was it a producer? Or was it somebody from the community who didn't engage with the venture? And then the third type of code that we used was whether it was indirect or direct, because just to remind you, we were looking actually at the impacts on children. and children may not necessarily be the primary stakeholder for all the ventures. So once we finish coding this within a venture, because again, we looked at 6 ventures in 3 different types of strategies, within a venture, we actually aggregated all the impacts for each type of stakeholder, and then we also compared the impacts across the stakeholder within each company. And because many of you work for, say, one company, this is probably where you are doing most of your analysis. We then compared impacts within the 2 companies that were part of the strategy. So for example, we looked at customers of Sanergy and we compared them to customers of Pender Health because both of them fell into the strategy where you're selling a service to the BOP. And then thirdly, we actually took the stakeholders and their areas of well-being and we compared them across the 3 strategies. So here we're looking at, okay, customers that buy a product versus customers that buy a service. What are the different types of impacts on those 2 groups across those 3 strategies? So based on these types of analysis, we then developed findings and we also developed recommendations based on those findings. So I think the most important thing to take away from here is data analysis is really important because it then defines your next steps, both your findings as well as your recommendations. Can we move to the next slide, please? All right. Let's get into one of the high-level findings, and what you can see on your left is the table that Heather showed you back earlier, I think on slide 9. What we've done is the stakeholders are along the columns, and then the area of well-being are along the rows. And we just wanted to show you one type of analysis we did where we looked at the economic well-being across those 5 stakeholders. Again, like we said, you probably work for maybe one enterprise, so you may not need to compare them across the strategies that we did. But you can still do the same aggregations and comparisons that we're talking about within your own venture. And then we also encourage you to maybe compare your impacts with other enterprises to really understand and improve your value proposition, as well as, you know, when you're explaining it to a third party. Okay, so here the example is based on the economic well-being ranges across the stakeholders. So we found, let's look at customers of a product. You know, there is definitely a one-time cost, probably a one-time. It could also be multiple times, like in the case of patrimonial oil. But there is a one-time payment to buy the product, and this could reduce financial resources available for children. Now, when you look at customers of services, it's more of an ongoing cost. So, for example, Pender was trying to move the mindset more towards preventive healthcare versus curative healthcare. So, bring your child in for regular checkups, not just when they fall ill. But then the third thing, what we saw is that the more substantive negative economic impacts could be on the children of producers and distributors because they have a larger amount of costs incurred. So for example, let's look at the distributors in Sanergy. They had to buy the FLT, the actual toilet, for $588, and that's a huge cost to them. They probably need a big business investment loan. Let's look at producers in Via Andina. They have to meet organic standards. They have to join a farmer association to be even able to work with Via Andina. So again, there are costs incurred over there. So what we found is that when you look at economic well-being across the stakeholders, there is a potential for negative impacts in that area. And then the implication for managers is that, you know, you need to provide support, either internal support or find a third party that can provide the support, or you can use a different kind of payment scheme. And again, I don't want to go into the details of the recommendations. They're all available in the individual reports that we made for each of the social enterprises, and the link to that is on the contact page. I'm actually going to move on to the next finding. And in the next finding, what we wanted to show you is another way of analyzing your data is, let's look at one stakeholder, so distributors, and let's compare them to all the other stakeholders. So let's compare the distributors to the customers and the distributors to the folks in the community. Now here, what we're doing is we're looking at the 3 areas of well-being, and when we compared distributors' children to customers' children, we saw that, okay, distributors' children are getting the same positive impacts that customers' children get when they use a product or a service. But in addition to that, they're also getting additional capability and relationship well-being impacts. So examples of that is distributors, when they work with a venture, they're getting training, they're getting business training, communication training, and consciously or subconsciously, they may be taking the learnings from that training and implementing them on their children. So children learn indirectly through that. Another relationship well-being impact that we can talk about right now is the size of the social network increases for distributors. So for example, in Sanofi, we heard one of the distributors telling us that before she used to be a vegetable seller and she didn't really know a lot of people, but now as a distributor, as somebody selling sanitation service through the use of the toilet, she knows so many more people. So her children now have access to her social network. And I guess the implication from this is that, you know, there is a conversation that needs to be had between scaling up your impacts versus scaling deep your impacts. Because one thing we want to highlight is distributors' children, they tend to be the smallest group, but they also tend to get the deepest level of impact, both in terms of magnitude and likelihood, and also a variety of impacts when you compare them to the customers or the children in the community. So we just want to say that there is need for conversation around that. All right, I'm going to go on to the next finding. This is a third kind of analysis where we're actually comparing groups of stakeholders to one another. So you see the dark red comparing them to the light red. And again, the other nuance here is that we're only really looking at capability well-being and relationship well-being. We're only comparing those 2 areas of impacts. So when we did the analysis, we realized that there were a lot of commonalities in impacts in capability and relationship when you looked at stakeholders that worked with the venture, so producers, distributors, and employees, versus those that didn't work with the venture, so customers and community. And like I mentioned, with the distributors, you know, there's that increase in knowledge from the trainings. There's that also the increase in social networks because of working with so many other people that are also engaged with the venture. So here the quick implication for managers is, you know, strengthen networks for your distributors and producers and employees by regularly bringing them together. I mean, the advantage here is not only are they meeting each other and strengthening their network, but they're also able to discuss challenges that they individually face and solutions that they've implemented, and they can share their best practices. And then, of course, a lot of times we hear about quality child support. A lot of the times, what we saw is that the parents or the caregivers now no longer had to go off to a far-out place to look for work. They could actually work in their local area and be closer to their children, but sometimes they worked longer hours or they needed to have childcare for their children. And then the last kind of analysis, which is the 4th one, is related to the community. And here we wanted to actually talk about the network effect. So what we found is that children of the community members who didn't engage with the venture, they actually experience the most number of impacts when there is a venture selling services in the local area. And the reason we're saying this is because when we compare the impacts on children in the community for services-based ventures versus the product or the sourcing-based ventures, we found that because of a network effect, that the health of the treated group was also leading to improvements in the health of the non-treated group. So and also the more people that were using that particular service, the more improvements we're seeing in the community. Also, if you are improving a public good, of course, those improvements are going to be enjoyed by community members as well. So let's talk about that through examples. Let's look at Sanofi. Sanofi providing a sanitation service. When you're reducing the amount of human waste on the roads, you're reducing the the number of times children come into contact with that human waste. So you're improving the health of the community or improving the cleanliness of the community. Let's look at the example from Penda. So what Penda does is they send SMSs to not just, they send SMSs to their patients, but those patients then actually go ahead and forward it to their friends and family who are not necessarily Penda's patients. So these guys are also learning about best practices for healthcare, for preventive healthcare. So that's what we're saying by a network effect. And the implication for managers here, again, is one of the conversations is scale up versus scale deep. Again, for investors with limited resources, if you want to reach the largest number of people, which is children in the community, maybe you want to look at ventures that sell services. If you are looking to create the deepest impacts, you want to focus on other sorts of strategies. So we're just trying to say these are the kinds of conversations you should have. Finally, the last slide before I hand it over to Kat is a summary slide. You know, it's very simplistic, of course, then there are a lot more details, and in fact, we want to talk about those details in our workshop. But the first step is, conduct your literature review, assuming you're using the POP framework, fill in your 3x3, think about your positive as well as negative impacts, then go out into your community and actually collect that qualitative data. We use semi-structured interviews, we use focus groups, there are other methods available. One best practice we've come to find is that if you're doing interviews, limit them to an hour and a half. Also, do not generalize what you find in your interviews to the entire population in that region. And then the third step is code and analyze your data. So we're going to go into a quick poll, but after that, Kat is going to present on Sunny Money's experience in qualitative impact evaluations. She's our guest speaker. We're really excited to have her. She's the Director of Research and Impacts at SolarAid.
Hi, I'm going to launch a quick poll that I hope that our attendees today will answer as quickly as possible. If you could please click on the answer, one answer only, and then click Submit. I'll give people a few minutes to do so. Actually, a few seconds. I don't have a few minutes. Okay, I'm going to close this particular poll and show you what you said. Sounds like most of you used mixed methods to assess your impact at the moment. And I have one more question to ask. And here on this question, you can click as many answers as apply to your particular situation. Okay, I'm going to close this and show you what you said. Looks like the biggest challenge is internal human resource capacity. So thanks to our audience for answering these two quick questions, and we're happy now to hear from Kat Harrison from SolarAid. Kat?
Great, thank you very much, Sandra, and I would love to say that I can adapt my presentation on the fly to the poll results, but hopefully I'll address some of them even if I can't do that. So I'm going to talk through some of the things we learned from the study that WDI we did with the recommendations, and then a bit about our research at SolarAid and some tips. So next slide. First of all, I just wanted to set the scene, tell you a little bit more about SolarAid so you can see where we're coming from. So 600 million people have no access to electricity in Africa, and as a result, hundreds of millions use kerosene lamps, candles and torches to light their homes after dark, which is costly, polluting and produces dim light. So SolarAid's mission is to eradicate the kerosene lantern from Africa by 2020, so pretty ambitious goal. And we do this by getting small portable or pico solar lights to those living off-grid in rural Africa. So we set up Sunny Money, a SolarAid social enterprise, which is the enterprise that WDI did a study on. So we helped to build a market for these lights, to drive innovation, reduce prices, and increase quality. So, next slide. So in 2012, WDI chose Sunny Money to be part of a study on social enterprises, and this in itself allowed us to use the results in a different way than we might have if we commissioned the study ourselves. It meant the research question was framed externally, and as Heather and Yaquta said, it focused on children under 8. It was also conducted at a time when SolarAid were just beginning to design and build our own M&E processes, so we were very new to the whole thing. Next slide. So the good news about the results from the WDI study is that nothing was unexpected. However, the study was of great value as it allowed us to talk with donors, supporters, and partners. Having an external study validates claims we make ourselves, as it adds a certain credibility with the absence of bias. It allowed us to discuss at senior some of the ways we could maximize impact and reduce potential negative effects. So it provided a discussion forum, a talking point, which we didn't really have at the time. And the results also supported some of the learning we were starting to find ourselves, which changed our marketing strategies to more effectively reach people. So for example, before, we had for students and parents had focused on solar lights being good for child study. But the WDI study and our own research was showing that families value the solar lights because they allow them to save money. So we changed our leaflets to talk about both these benefits so we could better target and reach people most relevant. Next slide. So how did SolarAid use the recommendations? Well, the study was focused on children under 8, and the recommendations focused around improving the outcomes for this specific group. While this is very important to SolarAid and Sunny Money, it's never been an express focus for the organization. So some recommendations left. But what was important was having an opportunity to think about how our work specifically affected different stakeholders or beneficiary groups, and I think that's where qualitative research can really help drilling down into those kind of details. There was a focus around improving access by offering more services to stakeholders. So for SolarAid, that was around pay-as-you-go technology. So again, while SolarAid had already been thinking about the best way to approach this, and indeed right now we're trialing 2 different technologies, having this external research or focus on it to validate and essentially support expenditure and investment on this was helpful for us making decisions internally and for talking externally with supporters or donors. Another recommendation that came out of the study was that our distribution model was not always clear to stakeholders, and this showed that we needed to better communicate our plans so that we can support the next stage of market growth. So whether the research is done internally or externally, you can see that it helps to perhaps target or tie up certain areas that you can improve and maximize impact on. Next slide. So at SolarAid, we've now developed and built a really strong M&E research and impact measurement function. We know it's key to learning from our work and therefore being better, stronger, more effective, and reaching more people. We use mixed methods here, so the quantitative and the qualitative. I think there can be a real focus on quantitative methods as people often put more value on numbers. While we think this is important at SolarAid, we don't think that numbers alone can tell the whole story. In fact, I sort of see numbers as providing an outline drawing. You can see the shape, but the qualitative results provide the color and shading. They give the numbers meaning and allow a fuller analysis and understanding of what is really happening. It's also a great way of engaging with and making stakeholders feel valued. The good thing about a qualitative approach is that it can require a smaller sample size for learning, which means that it can be a great way to start with M&E at an organization. It's less costly, and it can also help with fundraising and communications. So building case studies and stories of real-life beneficiaries allow organizations to showcase examples of how their work has had impact. But probably linking back to what Yaquta and Heather were saying, having qualitative research also means you can talk to many more different types of people or different types of stakeholders, because there's perhaps less emphasis on increasing sample sizes and more on learning for development. Qualitative approaches can still be analyzed by categorizing answers, as Heather said, through coding. So we tend to ask a combination of open and closed-ended questions through the interviews that we conduct, so that we can draw conclusions and statistics, but also have a whole host of quotations and case studies we can use to tell the story of our work and impact. We also look beyond the changes in economic well-being, because this, again, just tells one part of the story. So we know that the families we work with experience savings and increased income, but they also experience increased opportunities for social interaction, improved health, increased feelings of security, safety, and development, as well as children feeling more able to engage at school as they can keep up with their homework. To strengthen our research and learning, we're also engaging with different partners, other NGOs, research institutions, and donors to validate the results of our own research, but also to have an opportunity to focus on impacts, important areas, such as how our work might affect women and girls differently from men and boys. It also provides us with an opportunity to drill down in more depth on important issues, such as the impact of solar lights in education. Next slide. So I know that lots of social enterprises struggle with some of the challenges of research in M&E. So in this slide I thought I'd just share some thoughts or tips on how to get around some of them. So cost is often a real barrier to collecting useful and usable data. That's where qualitative research can come in. Collecting case studies and stories is often less time intensive than some of the more involved quantitative research. You can conduct short interviews with stakeholders via phone if possible, or even online if your stakeholders are relevant for that sort of category, and collect some really rich feedback to use for learning, as well as quotations for use for impact storytelling. Another challenge that we often hear is lack of resources. One of the ways we get around this at SolarAid is that we've got in touch with universities and we offer students summer research placements working on a specific topic. It's a great opportunity for a student to work with an implementing organization, and a great way for organizations to get a focused research topic covered, even if it might be predominantly desk-based. Another major tip I would suggest is build your M&E function slowly. So lay strong foundations and collect information on what is key. You can worry about layering on more detailed and complicated indicators and methods later, but keep it simple. Then lastly, if you're grant funded, make sure M&E is part of your application budget. Donors expect reporting on the impact of their donation or their grants, so making sure they're supporting the collection of that information is key. It's pretty normal to allow 5% of a grant, but for more focused projects or innovative donors, 10 to 15% of a grant can be given specifically for M&E research or impact measurement. Lots more tips which I'm happy to share later, but I'm going to hand back over to Sandy for any questions.
Thank you, Kat. Very, very interesting, your experiences with the research you've done. We are at the end of the presentation portion of the session today. So at this time, I would like to pose some questions to all of our presenters that have been sent to me throughout the presentations. So, but before I do that, I'd like to ask Heather to advance to the next slide. And the reason for advancing is because there is contact information for everyone on this slide, and I'd like that to be visible to everyone as we have our question and answer period. So the first question, there are several questions, by the way, about the interview process and methodologies. But the first question is this: how do you measure the network effect? Did you use any SNA or UCI NET? If not, could you tell a little bit more about how you reached the network effect conclusion?
Yeah, I'll jump. This is Heather. I'll jump in here. How we reached that conclusion was by doing interviews with people in the community and trying to ask, since Sanergy has entered the community, have you noticed any differences in your children? So we only asked questions. We did not use the methods that you had talked about. We not only heard that children in the community were getting less sick, and like the ground around the homes of those people in the community that live near the sanitation toilets that Sanergy creates was cleaner, so there was less waste on the ground near there because the franchisee has to keep the ground clean and keep it tidy. So children who play on the ground were less likely to come into contact with waste. But we heard from community members who don't even use the toilet that their children had experienced some changes in their health since a sanitation facility was put close to their home. We also heard from clinics in the area that they noticed a change as well. Of course, we can't say that we're sure that all this change in children being healthier is due to Sanergy, but we can assume that Sanergy contributes to that based on the causality we're seeing. For Sanergy to make a strong statement about that, and they probably want to move into the next phase, which is the performance analysis phase, to quantify what change there is, and there they would probably want to use some more rigorous methods.
Very good. Thank you, Heather. The next question is, how do program managers verify that you have identified the proper stakeholders in places with very different languages and cultures?
Yeah, that can be tricky. This is Heather, and I'll jump in, and Kat and Yaquta could jump in too. I really think back to the slide we had earlier. I'll pull it up in the meantime, and then I'll put the contact information back on. But I think it's really looking at this slide and trying to think about who else, oops, I don't know what happened there. Who else is there that we want to talk to besides just the basic stakeholders, such as employees of the company or those using the service or providing the service? Who else is there? Are there people in the government I want to talk to? Are there other NGOs? Are there people within the community that don't use the product or service? What about people that stopped working there? I think this is the stakeholder that's missed the most. So I think just making sure you're trying to get a range of different people to talk to with very different perspectives is the best you can do. That being said, if you're going to go do an assessment like this, you need to also keep in mind that if you're working with a company, they may be selecting who you talk to, and you therefore may just be getting some of the more positive stories. So try to ask if you can talk to people that have left the program, and because they're most likely the people that are upset, and you need to hear those people that have left have the most feedback on how the company can improve.
Yeah, what I would add is, especially given part of the question that you don't understand the language or the culture, I think doing that initial homework before you actually head to the local community, like speaking to experts. I think experts have a wealth of knowledge, and experts can be practitioners, they can be academics who've worked in that space. They may even know the local language, and they can help you think through what are the different types of cultures over there. So that's what I would also add.
And I think I'd probably bring it down a few levels and say that engaging, if you're talking about within an organization, engaging all the staff to sit down and almost map out the stakeholders they think they interact with or that the work impacts on, and even talking with those stakeholders you have already identified to try and understand if there are others that have been missed off that mapping or missed off people's thoughts.
Thank you, everyone, for your answers to that particular question. The next question is it necessary to compare the results of the company we are analyzing with another company that is in a similar market?
I wouldn't say, this is Heather, I wouldn't say it's necessary. I think it's helpful. I think a lot of investors and donors, and especially if you want to do some marketing, I think with the findings, I think it's really helpful to be able to compare and say, look at my company. We have this capability well-being impact that our competitor doesn't have. That's why we're better, or something like that. I think it's helpful in those senses. It's also helpful, maybe you'll find the reverse, like your competitor has a capability well-being impact that you don't have, so you want to then design some part of your business to affect that capability, that area of capability well-being. So I think it can be both ways. It could be strategic to understand and modify your business model to match that of your competitor or even be better than your competitor, or it could be used to really market yourself as well as share why your model is so good at what it does.
Thank you, Heather.
Adapting it slightly, where I think comparing results with a similar, Sorry, I would just say comparing with I guess a competitor, if termed that way, is useful for learning and identifying perhaps areas to collaborate and support one another rather than necessarily from a competitive perspective, but it depends on the nature of the organization.
That's a great point. That's a great point. We're seeing a lot more collaboration within this field, so it would be a great way to identify something like that as well.
Thank you, everyone. The next question is this. In terms of the interviewee list, were direct and or indirect competitors a part of the external organizations interviewed? And a second and part of that question is, how many people are on the WDI assessment team?
Yeah, for our interviews, we did try to reach out to competitors. Sometimes it's just up to them. Well, it is up to them if they want to participate, and most of the time they didn't want to participate, but we did attempt to reach out to them. And if we couldn't do an interview, we tried to collect other types of data from their website, et cetera, trying to understand how they were different, et cetera, and their types of impacts that they have. And then within our, to answer the second question, within our team, we're a smaller team, and it's Yaquta and myself, along with some professors that we work with regularly, including Ted London, some other professors at other universities as well. But we are growing.
Thank you, Heather. We're coming down to the end of our session, but I have time for a couple of more questions. Do you feel that cultural anthropologists or the ethnographic process more broadly have a role to play in enriching the identification of stakeholders and the kind of questions and answers posed?
Yeah.
So I'll speak over here. Oops, sorry.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay, now I would say yes, there's definitely a role. We recently met somebody who has a huge team of anthropologists working at his organization, and we definitely feel there's a role for them. I mean, they're part of the expert roster that we would reach out to. They have a really thorough understanding of culture, of language, and I know these are soft things to talk about, but I cannot emphasize the importance of culture, how different people are in different regions, and our practices are so different. So yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Next quick question. Was the length of the interview what was the length of the interviews in terms of time and number of questions?
Yeah, this
so
is
what
Heather.
Oh, go ahead, Heather.
Okay. What we found is that, and I think Yaquta might have mentioned this, we found that about an hour to hour and a half is probably the maximum that you can get out of a qualitative interview with the BOP stakeholders. We find with translation and back translation, because we very rarely were we able to conduct an interview fully in English, so that reduces the amount of time you actually have. So it's an hour and a half with all that translation in it. And we find that usually it ends up coming down to like maybe 30 questions. That's a really rough estimate because it totally depends on how free the person is with going into detail. Because some cultures you'll find that people kind of stay at the surface level, and it's really hard for them to go deep into going deep into the different types of impacts. They want to just answer the question yes, no. It's hard for them to maybe elaborate more. But other cultures, it's very different. So it really depends on the place and the stakeholders, I would say. But there's lots of techniques for both situations for kind of trying to get someone to be a little bit more wordy with their responses, and as well as the opposite.
Okay, thank you, Heather. This will be the last question we'll answer on air, but please know we'll answer any other questions we didn't get to offline through email. Here's the question. Were the organizations you interviewed all in the same country? What was the time frame of these studies. For example, how long had the organizations been in place, and at what point did you do your analysis?
Yeah, this is Heather again. These companies were they were picked actually to be in different locations and targeting totally different communities. So one was in Mexico, one was in Peru, and then one was in Tanzania, and then the rest were in Kenya, but with very different communities that they were targeting, so they weren't all operating the same spot. We wanted to be able to compare across sectors, so these were all different sectors included in our analysis. It was also all different types of geographies because we want to compare across both using the same framework. All the companies were in different stages as well because that was another intended variable to be different, to be able to look at these. Patrimony Oy of Cemex is quite old compared to, say, Sanergy, who's it was a more recent startup by MIT students. We did the analysis back, we did the analysis of all the ventures at the same time, but what we did is we did field visits at different points in time. So we started with a field visit with Patrimony Oy, and then we did one for another company, and then sometimes, because some of the communities were close together, we would try to do them back week to week back. And then once we had all the data together, that's when we did the full analysis.
Thank you, Heather. This brings us to the conclusion of today's webinar session. I hope that everyone that attended enjoyed the presentation as well as learned something that they can take away and start doing within their own situation and their own enterprise. Again, the recording of this webinar will be sent out via a link to everyone that attended today and or registered for this particular webinar. Please register for our next webinar, the third in this series. And if anyone has any questions, again, contact anyone.